I never planned to stop at the Gilded Hollow. It wasn't even on the map. The hotel's neon sign flickered through the thick fog like a ghostly beacon, and after hours of driving, I didn't think twice about pulling over. But from the moment I stepped inside, something about the place felt wrong. The desk clerk didn't look up right away, his gaunt face illuminated by the dim glow of a single bulb overhead. When he finally did meet my eyes, his smile was too wide, too fixed, like he'd been waiting for me. "Room on the top floor," he said, handing me a key before I'd even asked. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I climbed the narrow staircase, the creak of each step cutting through the oppressive silence. The air grew colder as I ascended, a faint musty smell settling in my nose. Peeled slightly at the edges, and the dim light overhead flickered just enough to make me hesitate. At the top. The key in my hand felt heavier than it should as I stopped in front of room 306, the brass. Numbers on the door were tarnished, their surface mottled with age. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was strange. It wasn't dirty or neglected, not exactly, but it felt like it had been abandoned mid-use, as though someone had left in a hurry and never returned. The bed was neatly made, but the pillow was slightly dented like it had recently been used. A faint outline of a cup sat on the nightstand, though there was no glass in sight. The air was thick, like the windows had been sealed shut for years. I tried to open one, but the latch didn't move. Even the hinges seemed fused, refusing to budge no matter how hard it pushed. I dropped my bag near the bed and glanced around. The room sparsely decorated, a desk, a single chair, and a tall mirror in the corner. It all seemed functional, but quite match, as though it had been pieced together from different decades. Shaking off the unease, I sat on the bed and pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. "Figures," I muttered, tossing the phone onto the nightstand. As I leaned back, the silence of the room pressed down on me. It wasn't peaceful or quiet. It was suffocating, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every creak, every distant hum. And then came the tapping. Faint at first, like fingertips brushing against the wall. I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew. Louder, rhythmic, like someone was walking just outside the room. I stood and moved to the door, pressing my ear against it. The tapping stopped. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my pulse quickening. Slowly, I turned it and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. The long, dim corridor stretched out in both directions, empty and still, but as I closed the door, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was inside the room. The sound was unmistakable now, sharp, deliberate, and coming from somewhere inside the room. My breath caught as I scanned the small space. The bed, the desk, the mirror, all exactly as they had been, but the sound kept going. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. I grabbed my phone, shining its flashlight around the room. The light flickered over the desk, the chair, the mirror, nothing. And then I saw it. The mirror in the corner. It wasn't just reflecting the room. It was showing something, more. In the faint glow of my flashlight, I could see the bed, the desk, and myself standing there. But the walls behind me looked different, darker, almost as if they were covered in shadows that didn't belong. My pulse quickened as I realized the shadows were moving. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I turned toward the source, but there was nothing. There, I whipped back to the mirror. The shadows in the reflection grew darker, denser, like they were seeping into the room itself. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my bag. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. So deep it felt like a vacuum. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I edged toward the door, my hand fumbling for the knob. It wouldn't turn. I yanked harder, but it was stuck, as though the wood had warped around it. The mirror flickered in my peripheral vision, and when I turned to look, my reflection was gone. Instead, the mirror showed the empty room behind me, except it wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood in the corner, just out of reach of the light, its form barely visible. My throat tightened as it took a single step forward, closer to the mirror, its movement slow and deliberate. And then the tapping returned, this time right next to my ear. I spun around, the air in the room suddenly ice cold. My flashlight beam darted across the walls. But the space was empty. The tapping had stopped, but the presence in the room remained, heavy and suffocating. I slammed my fist against the door, shouting for help, but hallway outside stayed silent. When I turned back to the mirror, it was different again. My reflection was back, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its expression vacant but somehow menacing. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. I didn't move, but the reflection did. It leaned forward, closer to the surface, as if trying to push through. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the nearest object, a small stool by the desk, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards scattering across the floor. For a moment I thought I'd won, but as I backed away I realized the shards weren't just reflecting the room. Each fragment showed a different part of the hallway outside, except the hallway wasn't empty anymore. Figures moved in the reflections, their shapes vague and indistinct, drifting toward my door. My pulse thundered as the doorknob began to rattle. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. The rattling grew more violent, the knob twisting as if someone, or something, forced it open. The lights flickered overhead, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. The shadows in the mirror shards moved faster now, closing in on the door. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the window. It wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. The glass rippled under my hands like liquid. The door burst open behind me, slamming against the wall with enough force to make the room shake. I turned, my back pressed against the unyielding window, but the doorway was empty. And yet, I could feel them. The figures were there, just out of sight, their presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them, the tapping now coming from every direction, a chaotic, relentless rhythm. I screamed, clutching my head as the sound grew louder, overwhelming every other thought. And then, everything stopped. The tapping ceased, the air stilled, and the lights flickered back to normal. The door closed and the mirror shards were gone, replaced by a single unbroken mirror on the wall. But in the reflection, the room was empty. And so was I. I stood frozen, staring at the empty reflection in the mirror. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but my body wouldn't move. I tried to lift my hand, to touch my face, to confirm it was still there, but it was like I was locked in place. The room was eerily silent. No whispers, no tapping, just the faint hum of the overhead light. My breath came out in short, shallow bursts, clouding the mirror in front of me. Slowly, my reflection began to reappear, but something was wrong. It wasn't moving with me. The reflection stood still, its head slightly tilted, its vacant eyes fixed on mine. Knocking over the chair behind me, the sound echoed in the quiet room, but my reflection didn't flinch. "Stop," I whispered, as if pleading with it. "Just stop." It smiled. I turned and bolted for the door again, twisting the knob frantically. This time it opened, and I stumbled into the hallway. The carpet beneath my feet felt different, thicker, softer, like I was sinking into it. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the walls narrowing as I ran. Door after door lined the corridor, each identical with no numbers to mark them. The whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, coming from every direction. "Stay. You belong here. Don't leave us." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. The walls seemed to move, the patterned wallpaper shifting like waves, pulsing with the rhythm of My heartbeat. When I reached the end of the hallway, there was no staircase, no elevator, just a single door. It was marked with a brass plaque that read manager's office. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. The whispers seemed to stop, replaced by an oppressive silence. Gathering every ounce of courage, I opened the door. Inside was the lobby. But it wasn't how I remembered it. The front desk was gone, replaced by a massive mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. The old clerk was standing in front of it, his back to me, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You can't leave," he said without turning around. His voice was calm, almost kind. "Needs you." "What do you mean?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Finally he turned. His eyes were empty, his face pale and stretched, like his features were being pulled into the mirror behind him. "You're already part of it." The room began to ripple, the walls warping like liquid. My reflection appeared in the massive mirror, but it wasn't me. It was the same figure from before, smiling, waiting. I backed away, but the floor beneath me felt like quicksand. My legs grew heavier, my movements sluggish, as though the hotel itself was pulling me down. The mirror reflection stepped forward, pressing its hand against the glass. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt weightless as the room dissolved around me, the whispers becoming a deafening roar. The last thing I saw was my own face, distorted and hollow, staring back at me as the mirror swallowed me whole. The next day, a new guest arrived at the Gilded Hollow. The old clerk stood behind the desk, smiling his unsettling smile. "Room on the top floor," he said, handing over a key. The guest glanced around the empty lobby, feeling the weight of the silence. As they walked toward the stairs, they didn't notice the faint shadow flickering across the mirror behind them. Desk, a hollow, distorted reflection of the last person who had checked in. Me. Have you ever stayed somewhere that gave you the creeps? Comment below if this story reminds you of a place you visited. The first time I heard it, I thought I was dreaming. It was late, and I'd been dozing off on the couch when a voice jolted me awake. A woman's voice, muffled but frantic, calling out for help. I sat up, blinking in the dim light of the living room. "Help me, help me." It was coming from next door. I froze, my pulse quickening. The apartment next door had been empty for over a year. Mrs. Keller, my elderly neighbor, had moved out suddenly and no one had lived there since. But the voice sounded exactly like hers, desperate, pleading, like the way she used to yell when she needed help. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had fallen asleep and this was some half-dream blending into reality. But then I heard it again. "Please, someone, help me." The sound sent a chill racing down my spine. I grabbed my phone and crept into the hallway, the echoes of her cries pulling me closer to the door of the empty apartment. The hallway was dimly lit, the kind of lighting that made shadows stretch unnaturally long. I hesitated just outside my door, gripping my phone tightly, but frantic, coming from the apartment next door. Mrs. Keller's voice. I stood frozen, staring at the closed door to her old unit. My mind raced for explanations. Maybe someone had broken in, maybe the building manager had let a new tenant move in without my knowing. But the voice was too familiar, too unmistakable. "Please, help me." The urgency in her voice pushed me forward. I reached the door, pressing my ear against it. Cries were louder here, desperate and uneven, like someone gasping for air. I knocked hesitantly, my knuckles brushing the cold wood. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Keller, is that you?" The cries stopped. The sudden silence sent a shiver crawling up my spine. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for some kind of response. A faint creak came from inside the apartment, like a floorboard shifting under weight. I backed away, glancing at my phone. Should I call the police? The building manager? But what would I even say? I think I hear my neighbor who doesn't live here anymore, crying for help. They'd think I was crazy. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. They were faint, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth on the other side of the door. My breath caught in my throat. The air in the hallway felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to press closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I hurried back to my own apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart raced as I leaned against the door, straining to hear. But the cries didn't return. I spent the rest of the night on edge, my eyes darting to the wall every time the faintest noise echoed through the building. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of exhaustion and stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still there, just on the other side of the wall, watching, waiting. Every creak of the building making my heart race. I stayed under my blanket, clutching my phone like a lifeline, my eyes darting to the wall every time I thought I heard something. The next day, I told myself it was over. A weird dream, a bad case of sleep deprivation. It had to be one of those. By mid-morning, the sunlight streaming through my window made it easier to convince myself. But when night fell again, the unease crept back, pressing against my chest like a heavy weight. I tried to drown it out by turning up the TV, focusing on some mindless reality show. But just as I was starting to relax, the sound came again. "Help me!" It was louder this time, more frantic. The voice echoed through the wall, cutting through the sound of the TV as if it were in the room with me. I muted the screen, holding my breath, and pressed my ear to the wall. "Please, someone." The voice was clear, almost too clear, as if she were on the other side of the drywall. I jumped back, clutching my chest as my pulse quickened. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't normal. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building manager again. He picked up after 3 rings, sounding groggy. "What now?" he muttered. "The cries are back," I said, my voice trembling. "It's worse tonight. You need to come check." He sighed audibly. "Look, like I said before, that apartment's empty. It's been locked for months. No one's been in there." "I can hear someone," I snapped. She's begging for help." "Lady, it's probably just the pipes or something." His voice was laced with impatience. "Old buildings make noise, okay? I'm not coming out there unless you can prove there's an emergency." I opened my mouth to argue, but the line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, the voice still ringing in my ears. This time, though, I couldn't just stay in my apartment and hope it stopped. I grabbed my keys and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes the hairs on your arms stand up. My footsteps echoed on hardwood floor as I approached them. Door to 2. The cries were louder now, muffled but insistent. "Help me!" I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the wood. For a moment, I thought about turning back, but something about the urgency in her voice kept me rooted in place. I knocked hard. "Hello, who's in there?" The cries stopped. My hand froze midair, the sudden silence making my ears ring. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped back. The doorknob rattled faintly like someone on the other side was gripping it. I stumbled back, my hand fumbling for my phone. As I hit the hallway light switch, it flickered once and went out, plunging space into darkness. The door to 2 creaked open slightly, just enough to reveal a sliver of blackness. "Mrs. Keller?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I stepped forward and pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. The air inside was thick and cold, the kind of cold that made your breath fog. Dust covered every surface, and the faint smell of mildew filled the air. The living room was bare except for a single chair in the middle of the room, facing the wall. The cries were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt worse. Footsteps echoing slightly and glanced around. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet I felt watched. As I moved further in, a faint creak sounded from the bedroom. My stomach dropped. I edged toward the door, my heart pounding. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently as though it had just been touched. "Hello," I called out. No answer. Pushing the door open slowly, I saw the bedroom was just as empty as the living room. The bed was stripped bare, its mattress covered in dust, but in the center of the bedspread, there was an imprint, like someone had been lying there recently. My breath hitched, and I turned to leave. That's when I felt it, a cold pressure on my shoulder, like a hand gripping me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room. A whisper, soft but distinct, brushed against my ear. "Why didn't you help me?" My legs felt weak as I stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door to two shut behind me. My breaths came in short gasps, my mind racing to process what had just happened. The cold grip, the whisper. It wasn't just in my head. I leaned against the wall, my phone shaking in my hand. The hallway was silent now, too silent. As if the building itself were holding its breath. The door to two stood closed, but I couldn't stop. Staring at it, half expecting it to creak open again. I retreated to my apartment, locking the door and sliding the deadbolt into place. Hovered over my phone screen, debating whether to call the police or a friend. But what would I? Even say, "There's someone crying in an empty apartment. A ghost grabbed me." They'd think I was crazy. I turned every light in my apartment on, hoping it would chase away the unease. But even with the brightness, the shadows felt heavier, thicker, pooling in the corners of the room like we're alive. And then I heard it again. "Help me, help me." The voice was louder this time, no longer muffled by walls or doors. It sounded like it was coming from my living room. My chest tightened as I turned toward the sound.
"Who's there?" I managed to whisper.
No answer. The air grew colder and the lights flickered overhead. My body froze as a faint outline began to take shape in the corner of the room. It was shadowy, indistinct, but I could see the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head. "Why didn't you help me?" The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't Mrs. Keller's voice. It was mine. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cries, the whispers, they weren't just haunting me, they were me. I stayed curled up on the couch, every light in the apartment blazing, watching the corners of the room until the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows. By morning, everything felt normal again, as if the night before had been a bad dream. But the apartment next door lingered in my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. I knocked on the building manager's office door later that day, determined to get answers. He stared at me like I'd lost my mind when I asked about Mrs. Keller. "She moved out over a year ago," he said slowly. "I told you that." "I know," I replied, my voice trembling. "But did anything?" "Apartment?" The look in his eyes changed, shifting from irritation to something more guarded. "You shouldn't be asking about that," he said, lowering his voice. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just say that some people leave more than just their furniture behind when they move." That night, I lay awake, every noise in the apartment setting my nerves on edge. I had locked my doors, double-checked the windows, but it didn't matter. The cries came again. This time, they didn't stop. They echoed through my walls, through my mind, louder and more frantic until they drowned out every other thought. And then, just before I screamed, they fell silent. The next morning, the building manager knocked on my door. "We've had some complaints," he said. "Your neighbor said they heard someone crying for help." "Are you okay?" I stared at him, unable to answer, because deep down I already knew the truth. The cries weren't coming from next door anymore. They were coming from me. Do you believe the cries were supernatural, or was it all in her mind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It started on a Tuesday evening. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the only sound in the apartment, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the kind of quiet that usually made me feel safe. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, soft but steady, breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, echoing oddly in the stillness. But when I held my breath, the sound continued. It was close, too close. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart pounding. Nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been 5 minutes ago. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was probably the pipes or a draft from the vents. But the sound wouldn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, slow and steady, like someone standing just behind me. Calm down, I muttered to myself, forcing a smile as I turned back to my book. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night dragged on, but the sound didn't stop. The slow, rhythmic breathing seemed to follow me wherever I went. I closed my book and turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out whatever was happening. The sound of a sitcom's laugh track filled the room, but beneath it, I could still hear it, soft and steady, like someone taking deliberate breaths just a few feet away. I stood abruptly, my pulse racing. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was nothing, just the old pipes in the building, but my body didn't believe it. My chest tightened, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I checked every corner of the room, throwing open the closet door and even peeking behind them. Curtains, nothing. Maybe I need sleep, I mumbled, trying to convince myself. I turned off the TV, shut off the lights, and went to bed. The sound seemed to fade as I lay under the covers, my heart still racing. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But just as I was about to drift off, it started again. This time, it was louder. My eyes snapped open, my body rigid. The breathing was closer now, as if someone was leaning over me. My own breath caught in my throat as I turned my head toward the corner of the room. Nothing, just darkness. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light swept across the room, illuminating the dresser, the chair in the corner, and the closet. Everything was where it should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The breathing stopped the moment I turned on the light. I sat up, clutching my phone like a weapon, and tried to slow my own ragged breaths. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was over. Maybe it had been a bad dream after all. But as I lay back down and turned off the flashlight, I heard it again, right next to my ear. Every time I closed my eyes, the breathing returned, steady and deliberate, as though it were taunting me. I stayed in bed until the first hint of dawn seeped through the curtains. The light brought a fragile sense of normalcy, and I felt brave enough to tell myself it had all been in my head. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the memory of the sound. By evening, my nerves were raw, and I decided I needed proof, something tangible to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. I grabbed my phone and set it to record audio. Placing it on my nightstand, I made sure it was angled toward the room. "Let's see if you're real," I muttered under my breath, though my voice trembled. That night, the breathing started again. It began faintly, just as it had before. I lay frozen in bed, listening as it grew louder, closer. I wanted to grab my phone, to turn on the light and chase it away, but I didn't. This time, I needed to know. The sound was unbearable, deep, rhythmic, and unmistakably human. It felt like whoever it was had settled in the room with me, just out of sight. My heart thundered in my chest, and my fist clenched the sheets, but I forced myself to stay still. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was impossible to tell. Finally, the breathing faded, and I reached for my phone with shaking hands. When I played back the recording the next morning, my stomach dropped. At first, it was normal, just the sound of me shifting in bed, the faint creak of the mattress. Then came the breathing, deep, slow, and deliberate. It wasn't mine. I rewound the recording, pressing the phone to my ear. The breathing wasn't just close, it was in perfect sync with mine, as though someone were mimicking my every inhale and exhale. Then came the sound of movement. A faint creak, like the floorboard shifting under weight. My breath hitched as I listened closer. The sound moved around the room, first near the bed, then toward the closet, and finally back to the nightstand. The recording ended with a faint whisper. "I'm here." I tried to convince myself it was some kind of interference, a trick of sound, but deep down I knew better. That evening, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment another night. I packed a small bag, ready to leave and stay with a friend, but as I reached for the door, the breathing started again. It was louder than before, more insistent. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sound seemed to surround me, coming from every corner of the room. "Stop it!" I shouted, spinning around. "Leave me alone." The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before they steadied again. My chest tightened as I backed into the living room, clutching my phone like a weapon. And then I saw it. In the mirror above the fireplace, something moved. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but it didn't move with me. Instead, it lingered, darker, shadowy, like a silhouette standing just behind me. My legs refused to move as I stared, transfixed. The shadow leaned forward closer to the surface of the glass, its shape becoming sharper, clearer. It didn't have a face, just a hollow void where features should have been. "Why?" a voice whispered, low and distorted. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut on its own. The breathing was deafening now, filling my ears and drowning out every thought. "Why won't you see me?" the voice whispered again, louder this time. I clawed at the door, pulling it open with every ounce of strength I had. The sound of breathing followed me into the hallway, fading only after I slammed the door shut behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for air. The silence was suffocating, but it was better than what had been inside. I didn't look back. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the cold, empty walls. The apartment door loomed behind me, but I didn't dare glance back. I just needed to get out. The stairwell seemed impossibly far, but the thought of staying near that door drove me forward. When I finally burst onto the street, the crisp night air hit me like a slap. It was only then that I realized how tightly I'd been clutching my phone, my knuckles white from the pressure. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but the suffocating weight that had filled the apartment lingered. Like a shadow. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move. My eyes stayed locked on the building. Front door half, expecting it to open, for the sound of breathing to follow me outside, but nothing happened. The street was silent, almost unnervingly so. I didn't know where else to go, so I called Maria. Maria didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. She could hear the fear in my voice. Within 20 minutes, I was at her apartment, wrapped in blanket and clutching a steaming mug of tea I didn't have the strength to drink. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" she asked gently, sitting across from me on the couch. I shook my head, staring at the floor. "You wouldn't believe me." "Try me." I hesitated, the memory of the breathing still fresh in my mind. It felt ridiculous to even say it out loud, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. There was my apartment. Maria's eyebrows knit together, but she didn't interrupt. I told her everything. The first time I'd heard it, the recording, the whispers and the shadow in the mirror. When I finished, she sat back, her face pale but calm. "Do you think it was—" she started, then stopped herself. "Don't," I said quickly. "Don't try to explain it. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal. Maria nodded, biting her lip. "You're not going back there, right?" "Not if I can help it," I said. I stayed with Maria for 2 days. I told myself I'd figure something out, maybe break my lease, and find somewhere else to live, but I couldn't avoid the apartment forever. I needed my things, my laptop, my clothes, my passport. Maria insisted on coming with me, even though I begged her not to. You're not going back in. They're alone, she said firmly, and I'm not letting you live like this. The apartment building was eerily quiet when we arrived. The air felt heavier the moment we stepped inside, a cold pressure settling in my chest. When we reached my door, I froze. The wood looked the same, but something about it felt off, as though it were breathing with the same rhythmic cadence I'd heard for days. Maria nudged me gently. Let's just grab your stuff and go, okay? I nodded, unlocking the door with trembling hands. The apartment was silent, just as I'd left it. Everything seemed untouched. The furniture, the pictures on the walls, even the blanket I'd thrown on the couch in my rush to escape. But the air was thick, suffocating. We moved quickly, Maria packing my clothes while I grabbed my essentials. My hands shook as I zipped up my bag, the silence pressing down on us like a living thing. And then I heard it. The breathing. It started faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with every passing second. Maria froze, her eyes wide. Do you hear that? She whispered. I couldn't answer. The sound wasn't just coming from the apartment. It was everywhere. The walls seemed to exhale, the air growing colder with each breath. Maria backed toward the door, clutching my bag. We need to leave, now. The lights flickered, plunging the room into a dim, stuttering glow. In the mirror above the fireplace, the shadow reappeared. It wasn't faint this time. It was vivid, sharp, and moving. Closer to us. Why are you leaving? The voice whispered, low and guttural. The shadow moved faster, its indistinct form rippling as though it were struggling to break free from the glass. Maria screamed, fumbling with the door as I grabbed her arm, yanking her into the hallway. The doctor slammed shut behind us with a deafening thud, the sound reverberating through the building. We didn't stop running until we were outside. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. Maria helped me find a new place across town, somewhere bright and modern, with large windows and no mirrors. For a while I thought I was free, but the breathing followed me. It started faintly again, just as it had before. At night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear it, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. And then one night, as I stared into the darkness, the voice returned. You can't leave me. I didn't sleep after that. Do you think the breathing was a haunting or something darker? Let us know what you think in the comments below.